All right, today's lesson is on plot structure. Now you should have your notes page to go along with this presentation, and you need to take notes because you will submit those notes as well as keep a copy of those notes for yourself. Plot structure is a very important part of literature. That's why we talk about it first. And so let's just dive right into it. Let's talk about what a plot actually is. A plot is the literary term that describes the pattern of events in a story. Another way that's described is this as the sequence of actions, the different things that happen in the order in how they happen. This is how a story becomes more and more complex. It has to serve some kind of organizational pattern, structure, however you want to word it, but it's got to follow some type of order in order for it to make sense. I'm sure you've heard of people say, well, the plot of a movie was this, and then they go on to explain what happened in the movie. Same thing in a story. Okay, plot is the same for both of those things. Now, there are three types of plots. We're going to talk a little bit more about each one, but on your notes page, you just need to write down what those three are. They are chronological, flashback, and the third one is maybe one you haven't heard of. It's called in media res. If you ever need to pause the video, you are more than welcome to pause the video to take notes. You have that option. I'm going to move on to chronological. All right, so this is the most basic type of a plot. A story starts, things happen, things get a little more complicated, and then things come to an end. It follows a very straightforward timeline. There's not any hopping back and forth in time. And so a good example that I have of this is the Hunger Games. All right, in the Hunger Games, you learn about Katniss Everdeen. She volunteers a tribute to save her sister, and then she ends up becoming the face of this revolution against an oppressive government. And so, it's very straightforward. There's not a lot of back and forth of things happening in the future or things happening in the past. Our next type of plot is a flashback. Now, a flashback is also a pretty common type of plot. The example I chose is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Those of you that have played that video game. In Breath of the Wild, there are instances where the main character, Link, is going through the game and he remembers something about his past because he has lost his memory. And so through those flashbacks, through him regaining his memory, we learn more and more about the story and why the main villain, Ganon, came to be. And so, I thought this was a really good example. I'm sure you can think of some other examples of flashbacks in movies and in TV shows. All right, our last type of plot is one that you might not be familiar with, but you probably have seen it before, you just didn't know it. It's called in media res, and basically that means in the middle of something. And so in media res is a type of movie that is similar to a flashback. It starts in the middle of an action. So the example I've given you here is a movie Iron Man, the original Iron Man movie. In that movie, Tony Stark is driving in the desert. He's with the military. All of a sudden, he is ambushed and attacked, and he is blindfolded and taken to this cave where he's been captured by terrorists. Then the movie flashes back to earlier events that led up to that scene of him being attacked in the desert. From that point, then we go forward with the rest of the action of the movie, of him becoming Iron Man, really creating the Iron Man costume and persona, and defeating the bad guy. We learned that the bad guy was behind the capture of him in the first place. So this is an interesting type of story. We're actually going to, later on in the year, we're going to read a type of story that uses in media res. So you do need to familiarize yourself with this type of plot. Okay, so one of the simple ways that we talk about plot is through a plot pyramid. And you may have seen this before. This is a very simple way of showing you exactly what a plot is, how it's ordered, and just a simple plot structure that many authors follow. All right, and so you can see we have different parts here, such as the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So let's take just a minute and talk about each one of these. On your notes page, you should have a diagram that's just like this. You will need to fill in the blank with each of the definitions for each of these parts. Start with the exposition. The exposition is at the beginning of a story. It introduces the characters, setting, and the conflict of the story. This is where we learn who, what, where, and maybe a little bit about why the events of the story are happening. This is really important because it sets up the rest of the story. A good example I can think of is in the movie Harry Potter, or in the book Harry Potter. Some of you like to read. I do hope some of you like to read. But in both of those stories, Harry Potter, we learn that he is this boy whose parents were wizards, but he doesn't know that he's a wizard. And we see how he's mistreated by his aunt and uncle, and he has some extraordinary powers. And then all of a sudden we're introduced to the idea Harry learns that he's a wizard. All right, so the exposition sets up the characters, the setting, and the end of the exposition is where we're introduced to the conflict. Now we will talk a lot more about conflict in a few classes, but conflict is very important because without a conflict you really have no story. You have to have some type of friction, some type of reason why things aren't just perfect. You have to have some type of conflict to move the action forward in a story. Next is the rising action, and this is the action that takes place after the conflict. And so in the rising action, we see where maybe it's a good guy versus bad guy story, and now the good guy is having a few fights with the bad guy. He can't quite beat him just yet, but they're going back and forth and battling each other. This is where the plot becomes more complex. As you can see on our plot pyramid, the rising action rises. It goes up. It makes our story more interesting. This is really the meat of our story. This is what makes it whether or not we really want to read it. And so the rising action continues until we get to our third part of our plot pyramid, which is the climax. Now, the climax, I like to describe it as the most exciting part of the story. This is the most interesting part. This is the big boss battle if you're playing a video game. This is really important to the story. The conflict is going to be decided. Either the good guy is going to win or the bad guy is going to win. Either the hero is going to complete his quest or he's going to fail and people die, people suffer. So the conflict is decided here in the climax. So this is really the interesting part of a story. Next we have the falling action, probably the more boring part of the story. A lot of times falling action is either not included or there's just not a whole lot to say, because after the climax, after the most important part of the story, most exciting part, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Maybe this is where we learn about what happens with the characters. We see that, now that the bad guy is defeated, maybe things can kind of go back to normal, or maybe there's a new normal, like in the Hunger Games, where the revolution takes place and things are a little bit different, but maybe better. And so following action, yeah, it's important, but it's probably the least important thing of these 5. All right, our last thing is a resolution. This is the outcome. This is the ending. This is where we'll find out what happens to the characters. If it's a fairy tale, you know what the resolution is. They all lived happily ever after. So that's what we're seeing here in a resolution, where we kind of just wrap things up, put a bow on it, and tell what happens at the end of the story.